The worn leather of her traveling case scraped against the wooden platform as Hazel Bennett stepped down from the train at Dry Hollow Station. The September sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town, making her dark traveling dress feel heavier than it was. At 28, she stood taller than most women, her auburn hair pinned severely beneath a modest bonnet that had seen better days. The moment her boots touched the platform, she felt the eyes. They came from everywhere, the station master peering over his spectacles, two women with parasols whispering behind gloved hands, a group of ranch hands lounging against the depot wall. Their gazes traveled from her unadorned dress to her ringless fingers, then to the teaching certificate she clutched in her left hand. "That's her," she heard someone murmur, "the new schoolmarm from back east." Hazel had learned long ago that arriving in a new town was like stepping onto a stage. Everyone wanted to size up the newcomer, especially an unmarried woman of her age. She straightened her spine, a habit formed from years of standing before classroom boards, and made her way toward the station master. "Miss Bennett." The elderly man's voice carried a note of surprise, as if he'd expected someone different. Younger, perhaps, or prettier, or at least wearing a wedding ring. "Yes, sir. I believe the school board president was to meet me. That'd be Mrs. Hutchins. She's—" he glanced around nervously. "Running late, I reckon." Behind her, Hazel heard one of the ranch hands snicker. "Bet old Hutchins is giving her husband an earful about bringing in some spinster from Philadelphia." "Hush up, Jake," another voice warned. But the damage was done. The word spinster hung in the air like dust motes, visible and irritating. Hazel set her case down and folded her hands calmly. She'd been called worse. In Philadelphia, they'd whispered about the Bennett girl who'd turned down 3 marriage proposals. 2 particular. They'd said, "Think she's too good for honest men." The truth was simpler and more complicated. She'd come west not to find a husband, but to find peace, to teach children their letters without matchmaking mothers parading their sons past her desk, to live quietly without the constant reminder that she was aging past her prime, unwed and apparently unwanted. "Miss Bennett!" A shrill voice cut through her thoughts. A stout woman in an elaborate green dress bustled toward her, feathers on her hat bobbing with each step. "I'm Mrs. Prudence Hutchins. So sorry to keep you waiting." Mrs. Hutchins' smile didn't reach her eyes, which were busy cataloging every detail of Hazel's appearance. You're taller than I expected, and older. Your letter said you had 10 years teaching experience, but I assumed that I'd started teaching at 12. Hazel kept her tone light, but she saw the woman's lips purse. "Well, no matter. Come along. I'll show you to the boarding house. Mrs. Clearwater runs a respectable establishment for unmarried ladies." As they walked down Main Street, Hazel became increasingly aware of the attention she drew. Dry Hollow was smaller than she'd imagined, with false-fronted buildings lining a street that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. The Mercantile, the bank, 2 saloons, a small church with peeling white paint, and everywhere, watching eyes. Women pulled their children closer as she passed. Men tipped their hats with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something less pleasant. She heard fragments of conversation drift from doorways. "You're awful tall for a woman. You're 28 and never married. Something's wrong there. Better keep her away from my Henry." Mrs. Hutchins kept up a steady stream of chatter about the school. 22 students, ages 6 to 14. Previous teacher married a rancher and moved to California. But Hazel noticed how the woman angled her body, as if trying to shield the respectable citizens of Dry Hollow from the contaminating presence of an unmarried woman. The boarding house sat at the end of Main Street, a narrow 2-story building with lace curtains in every window. Mrs. Clearwater, a bird-like woman with sharp eyes, greeted them at the door. "So you're the new teacher." It wasn't a question. "3rd floor, last door on the right. Breakfast at 6, dinner at 5, no gentlemen callers after dark, no liquor, no loud noises. Church on Sundays is expected." Of course, Hazel murmured, though she'd never been much for organized religion. Her room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the vast prairie beyond town. As she unpacked her few belongings, 2 dresses, her books, her mother's silver brush, she heard voices drift up from the parlor below. "Mark my words. Mrs. Clearwater was saying. A woman that age, traveling alone, taking a job out here, she's running from something, or someone. Perhaps a scandal. Mrs. Hutchins suggested, her voice dripping with feigned concern. You know these eastern cities, all manner of impropriety. She's too pretty to be unmarried without reason. A third voice added, and did you see how she looked at the men bold as brass? Hazel closed her eyes. She hadn't looked at anyone boldly. She'd kept her gaze level and polite, as she always did. But that was the curse of being an unmarried woman. Every gesture was interpreted through the lens of suspicion. That evening, she took her meal in the boarding house dining room with 3 other residents, a widow who sewed for the Mercantile, an elderly woman who gave piano lessons, and a girl of perhaps 19 who worked as a Harvey girl at the railroad restaurant. They ate in near silence, the clink of silverware the only sound. You'll want to be careful, the widow finally said, not looking up from her plate. This town, they don't take kindly to women who don't know their place. And what place is that? Hazel asked quietly. The widow's smile was bitter. Married, minded, or moving on. That night, Hazel lay in her narrow bed listening to the foreign sounds of the frontier town, distant piano music from the saloons, the lowing of cattle in the stockyards, coyotes calling from the hills. She'd thought coming west would mean freedom from the suffocating expectations of society. Instead, she'd simply traded one set of watchful eyes for another. But she wouldn't run. Not this time. She'd come here to teach, and teach she would. Let them whisper. Let them speculate about why she remained unmarried. Why she'd chosen this life of chalk dust and children's primers over a wedding ring and a husband's name. Tomorrow, she would walk into that schoolhouse with her head high. She would teach their children to read and write and think. And if they wanted to gossip about the spinster schoolmarm, well, she'd survived worse. As sleep finally claimed her, Hazel thought she heard horses passing beneath her window, heading north toward the ranches beyond town. One rider paused, his horse's hooves shifting in the dust. For a moment, she wondered who rode through town so late, what business called them into the darkness. Then the hoofbeats faded, and she turned her face to the wall. She hadn't come to Dry Hollow to wonder about men on horses. She'd come for solitude, for purpose, for a life defined by her own choices rather than society's expectations. If only the town would let her have it. The small church of Dry Hollow stood like a weathered sentinel at the north end of town, its whitewashed boards peeling in places where the harsh prairie wind had worn them thin. Hazel arrived early that first Sunday, hoping to slip into a back pew unnoticed. She should have known better. Miss Bennett, Mrs. Hutchins' voice rang out across the churchyard. Come, you must sit with the other unmarried ladies. Hazel found herself herded to a pew on the left side, where 3 young women barely out of their teens giggled behind prayer books. Across the aisle sat the married couples, and behind them, the ranch hands and unmarried men. The segregation was as clear as if someone had drawn lines in chalk. She focused on the hymnal in her lap, trying to ignore the whispers that followed her like tumbleweeds. 2 weeks in Dry Hollow, and already she'd become the favorite topic of gossip. The schoolmarm who ate alone, the woman who walked with her chin too high, the spinner of tales to children who should be learning practical skills instead of poetry and literature. The church door opened, letting in a shaft of morning light and the smell of leather and horses. Hazel didn't look up, but she felt the shift in attention, the way conversations paused mid-sentence. That's Colt Ramsey. One of the young women beside her whispered to another, Owns the Broken Arrow Ranch north of town. Hardly ever comes to church, the other replied. Wonder what brought him today. Hazel kept her eyes on her hymnal, but she was aware of heavy footsteps moving down the aisle, the creak of a pew taking weight. When Reverend Davis called them to rise for the opening hymn, she finally looked up. He sat 3 rows ahead on the men's side, and even from behind, he commanded attention. Broad shoulders filled out a clean but worn jacket, dark hair, slightly too long for town standards, brushed his collar. When he turned his head slightly to share a hymnal with old Mr. Peterson, Hazel caught a glimpse of a strong profile, sun-weathered skin, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. Then he turned further, and their eyes met. Hazel had grown accustomed to the way men looked at her, some with speculation, wondering what flaws kept her unmarried, others with a kind of hungry calculation, as if she were a horse they were considering buying, a few with dismissal, finding her too tall, too plain, too educated for their taste. But Colt Ramsey didn't look at her that way. His eyes, a gray like storm clouds over prairie grass, met hers directly, held for a moment without traveling down to assess her figure or up to catalog her features. He simply looked at her, one human acknowledging another. And then he nodded. Once, a small, deliberate gesture of recognition and respect. Then he turned back to his hymnal, and Hazel found herself oddly breathless. Throughout the service, she tried to focus on Reverend Davis's sermon about the virtues of community and Christian charity, but her awareness kept drifting to the man 3 rows ahead. He sat perfectly still, back straight as a fence post, hands resting on his knees. When collection plate came around, he put in his offering without flourish. When they knelt to pray, he bowed his head with quiet reverence. After the final blessing, Hazel tried to slip out quickly, but the narrow aisle was clogged with parishioners eager to share their weekly gossip. She found herself trapped behind Mrs. Clearwater and her boarding house widow, who were discussing the impropriety of the new saloon girl's dress. "Miss Bennett." The voice was deep, gravelly, like it wasn't used often. Hazel turned to find Colt Ramsey standing beside her pew, hat in hand, up close. He was even more imposing, at least 6 feet tall, with shoulders that spoke of years of hard labor. His face was weathered but not old, perhaps 34 or 35, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he'd spent more time squinting into the sun than smiling. "Mr. Ramsey," she replied, surprised that she knew his name, more surprised that he knew hers. "Heard you're teaching the young ones their letters." It wasn't a question. His voice carried a neutral tone, neither approving nor disapproving. "Yes, I am." He nodded, that same single, deliberate gesture. "My nephew, Tommy, he's one of yours. Boy's been talking about nothing but books since you started." Tommy Ramsey. Hazel pictured the quiet 8-year-old who sat in the back row, the one who stayed after class to ask about the stories she read aloud. He's a bright child, very eager to learn. Something shifted in Colt's expression, though she couldn't quite name it. "His ma died 2 years back. My brother's been raising him alone, the boy. He's been quiet since then, but these past 2 weeks, he's been chattering like a magpie about school." "I'm glad he's enjoying the lessons." They stood there for a moment, an island of stillness in the churning social current of after-church gossip. Hazel was acutely aware that people were watching, that tomorrow there would be talk about Colt Ramsey speaking to the spinster schoolmarm. But Colt seemed utterly unconcerned with the attention. "Wanted to thank you," he said finally, "for whatever you're doing that's got him excited about learning again." Before Hazel could respond, he placed his hat back on his head, touched the brim in a gesture of farewell, and walked away. She watched him go, noting the way people stepped aside to let him pass. Not from fear, exactly, but from a kind of respect mixed with wariness. Well, Mrs. Hutchins materialized at her elbow, eyes bright with curiosity. "What did Colt Ramsey want with you?" "He was thanking me for teaching his nephew." The woman's tone suggested she suspected more. "You be careful around that one. Miss Bennet, Colt Ramsey's not the marrying kind, if you take my meaning. 34 years old and never taken a wife. There's talk about why. I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Hazel said coolly. He was simply being polite about his nephew's education. But as she walked back to the boarding house, she found herself thinking about storm gray eyes and a single, respectful nod, about a man who thanked a teacher for bringing light back to a grieving child's world, about the way he'd looked at her, not at her body or her unmarried status or her age, but at her. That afternoon, she sat in her small room preparing lessons for the week ahead. Through her window, she could see riders heading out to the ranches, and she wondered which direction the broken arrow lay. North, the girl had said. She imagined Colt Ramsey riding home, his broad back straight in the saddle, returning to whatever life a man led when he chose the company of horses and cattle over a wife and family. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. The young Harvey girl stood in the hallway, twisting her hands nervously. Miss Bennet, I'm sorry to bother you, but could you help me with my letters? I can read some, but writing... She trailed off, embarrassed. Of course, Hazel said, stepping aside to let her in. What's your name? Sally Morrison. I want to write to my mother back in Kansas, but I'm ashamed of my spelling. They spent the next hour working on basic letters, and Hazel discovered that Sally had a quick mind despite her limited education. As the girl carefully copied out words, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Hazel thought about all the reasons she'd come west. This was one of them. The chance to make a real difference. To teach not just children, but anyone hungry for knowledge. Miss Bennet, Sally said suddenly, looking up from her work. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why didn't you ever marry, I mean? You're educated and pretty enough, and you seem kind. Hazel had been asked this question in various forms since she turned 21. She had a dozen polite deflections ready, but something about Sally's genuine curiosity made her answer honestly. I never found anyone I could respect who also respected me, she said simply. Marriage should be a partnership, don't you think? Not a surrender. Sally's eyes widened. I never thought of it that way. My ma always said marriage was a woman's duty. Perhaps for some women, but I believe we each have our own path to walk. After Sally left, Hazel stood at her window watching the sun set over the prairie. Somewhere out there, at a ranch called Broken Arrow, a man was probably watching the same sunset. A man who had looked at her and seen simply her. She shook her head at her own foolishness. One respectful nod, one brief conversation, and here she was spinning romantic notions like a schoolgirl. She'd come to Dry Hollow for independence, not to moon over taciturn ranchers who probably spoke 10 words a week. Still, as she prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about tomorrow's lessons, about Tommy Ramsey in the back row, about what stories might bring more light to a grieving child's eyes, and if his uncle happened to hear about it, if it brought him to church again next Sunday. Well, she was only human, after all. The autumn wind rattled the schoolhouse windows as Hazel wrote the day's arithmetic problems on the board, 6 weeks into the term, and she'd settled into a rhythm with her students. They'd grown accustomed to her ways, the daily story hour, the emphasis on critical thinking over rote memorization, the expectation that girls could excel at mathematics just as well as boys. It was this last point that had begun to stir the pot of town gossip to a rolling boil. Miss Bennet, Sarah Hutchins, the school board president's daughter, raised her hand. My mother says I don't need to learn algebra. She says it's unwomanly. Hazel set down her chalk carefully. And what do you think, Sarah? The 12-year-old bit her lip. I like solving the problems. It's like puzzles. Then continue solving them. Knowledge is never unwomanly. Sarah, ignorance, however, is unflattering on anyone. She heard Tommy Ramsey suppress a giggle from the back row. The boy had blossomed these past weeks, no longer the silent shadow he'd been at term's start. He devoured every book she lent him and had begun writing stories of his own about cowboys and adventures. The day passed peacefully until dismissal. As the children filed out, Hazel noticed 3 men loitering near the schoolhouse door. Jack Thornton, who owned the largest mercantile, Bill Crawford, a prosperous rancher, and Eugene Hartley, the bank manager. All married men, all members of the school board. "Gentlemen," she greeted them, though their expressions suggested anything but gentle intentions. "Miss Bennett." Thornton spoke first, his thick mustache twitching with disapproval. "We need to discuss your teaching methods." "Oh, has there been a complaint about the children's progress?" Crawford snorted. "Progress? You've got girls thinking they can do figures like men. My Emma came home yesterday saying she wanted to learn bookkeeping." "A useful skill for anyone," Hazel replied evenly. "For a shopkeeper, maybe," Hartley interjected, his narrow face pinched with disdain. "Not for a future wife and mother. You're filling these girls' heads with notions that'll make them unmarriageable." Hazel felt her temper rise but kept her voice level. "I'm teaching them to think, Mr. Hartley. If that makes them unmarriageable to certain men, perhaps those aren't the sort of men they should marry." Thornton stepped closer, and Hazel caught the smell of tobacco and pomade. "You'd know all about being unmarriageable, wouldn't you? Miss Bennett, 28, and still Miss... Maybe that's why you're trying to turn our daughters into spinsters like yourself." "I'd ask you to step back, Mr. Thornton," Hazel said quietly. He didn't move. "You know, a woman your age, still untouched. It's unnatural. Makes a man wonder what's wrong with you. Frigid. Maybe. Or perhaps you prefer..." "I believe the lady asked you to step back." The voice came from behind the men, deep and steady as bedrock. Colt Ramsey stood in the doorway, his presence filling the frame. He wasn't holding a weapon, wasn't even standing particularly threateningly, but something in his stillness made the 3 men shift uneasily. "This doesn't concern you, Ramsey," Crawford said, though he took a half-step away from Hazel. "Tommy's education concerns me," Colt replied, "and I find myself mighty pleased with Miss Bennett's teaching. Boys reading better than some grown men I know." "She's teaching the girls algebra," Hartley protested, "and telling them they're equal to boys." Colt's gray eyes moved to Hazel, and she thought she saw something like amusement in them. "Are they not? My ma could calculate grain prices in her head faster than any man in the county. Saved the ranch more than once with her figuring." "That's different," Thornton blustered. "Your mother was, well, she was educated," Colt finished. "By a teacher who believed in teaching children to think. Seems Miss Bennett follows that same philosophy." The 3 men exchanged glances. Crossing Colt Ramsey wasn't something done lightly in Dry Hollow. He might be quiet, might keep to himself, but the Broken Arrow was one of the most successful ranches in the territory, and his word carried weight. "We'll be discussing this at the next board meeting," Thornton said finally, but the threat had lost its teeth. "Come on, boys." They filed out, giving Colt a wide berth. Hazel realized she'd been holding her breath and released it slowly. "Thank you," she said, "though I can fight my own battles." "Never doubted it," Colt replied. "But 3 against 1 didn't seem sporting." She began erasing the board, needing something to do with her hands. "They're not wrong. You know, I am teaching the girls they're equal to boys. I suppose that makes me dangerous. Good thing, too. World needs more dangerous women." She turned to look at him, surprised. He stood relaxed but watchful, like a man accustomed to reading the weather in cloud formations and wind shifts. "Your nephew's doing very well," she said, changing the subject. "He has a real gift for storytelling." "He talks about you constantly." Colt paused, then added, "Won't eat his supper until he's told us everything Miss Bennett said that day." "I'm glad he's enthusiastic about learning." "It's more than that." Colt's voice dropped lower. You've given him back something I thought was lost when his ma died. Hope, maybe, or just the belief that there's more to life than grief. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the empty classroom. Hazel was acutely aware that she was alone with a man, that tongues would wag if anyone saw, but she couldn't bring herself to care. Children are resilient, she said softly. They just need someone to remind them of that. Colt studied her for a long moment. Is that why you came west, to teach children resilience? I came west to escape. The words slipped out before she could stop them. She waited for him to ask the obvious question. Escape what, instead? He simply nodded. We all come west to escape something. He said, question is what we choose to build once we get here. And what are you building, Mr. Ramsey? Just trying to keep what I've got. Ranch, family, peace. He moved toward the door, then paused. Those men won't give up easy. Thornton especially. He's got his eye on you. I've noticed, Hazel said dryly. He accidentally brushed against me at the Mercantile yesterday. His wife was standing right there. Something flashed in Colt's eyes. Anger, maybe, or protectiveness. You need anything? Someone bothering you? You send word out to the Broken Arrow. Tommy can carry a message. I know you don't need anything, he interrupted gently. But sometimes it's good to know you've got neighbors who'll stand with you. After he left, Hazel sank into her chair, suddenly exhausted. The confrontation with the three men had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Not their words. She'd heard worse, but the intent behind them. The suggestion that being unmarried at her age meant something was fundamentally wrong with her, that she was somehow damaged or unnatural. That evening at the boarding house, the atmosphere was Arctic, Mrs. Clearwater served dinner in pointed silence while the widow and Sally Morrison kept their eyes on their plates. Finally, the old piano teacher, Miss Abernathy, spoke up. Heard you had visitors at the school today. News travels fast, Hazel murmured. Heard Colt Ramsey ran them off. He didn't run anyone off. He simply expressed support for my teaching methods. Men don't simply do anything when it comes to unmarried women. Mrs. Clearwater said sharply, you'd best be careful. Miss Bennett, your reputation is already hanging by a thread. Because I teach girls mathematics, because you're nearly 30, unmarried, and now you've got the most eligible bachelor in the county defending you. People will talk. People already talk, Hazel said quietly. At least now they'll have something interesting to say. She excused herself and climbed to her room. Outside her window, the prairie stretched endlessly under a darkening sky. Somewhere out there was the Broken Arrow Ranch, where a quiet man lived with his nephew and his principals. She thought about his words. World needs more dangerous women. No one had ever called her dangerous before. Difficult, yes. Stubborn, certainly. Too particular, too educated, too tall, too much of everything that made men uncomfortable. But dangerous, that was new, and strangely, she liked it. The next morning, a small package waited on her desk at school. Inside was a new box of chalk and a note in careful handwriting. For the dangerous education of young minds. A neighbor. Hazel smiled, tucking the note into her desk drawer. Let them talk, she thought. Let them whisper about the spinster school marm and the bachelor rancher. She had children to teach, minds to shape, and a future to build in this hard, wild country. And perhaps, just perhaps, she had an ally who understood that being dangerous was just another word for being necessary. The first Friday afternoon visit came unexpectedly. Hazel was cleaning the blackboard after dismissing the children when she heard boots on the schoolhouse steps. She turned, expecting to see an angry parent or another school board member. Instead, Colt Ramsey filled the doorway, holding a small burlap sack. Mr. Ramsey, she said, unable to hide her surprise. Miss Bennett. He removed his hat, revealing hair slightly flattened from the ride. Tommy forgot his reader. Thought I'd bring it by." He paused, then lifted the sack. "Also brought some corn from the harvest. Thought you might enjoy it." It was clearly an excuse. Tommy's reader was nowhere in sight, but Hazel found herself oddly touched by the gesture. "That's very kind. Would you like some water? You must have ridden quite a way." "If it's no trouble." She poured from the pitcher she kept on her desk, aware of his presence in a way that made the small schoolhouse feel even smaller. He accepted the cup with a nod of thanks, his fingers briefly brushing hers. They were calloused, working hands, but gentle in their movements. "How's the teaching going?" he asked after a moment. "Any more trouble from Thornton and his crew?" "Some cold shoulders at the mercantile, a few parents questioning my methods, but nothing I can't handle." "Never doubted it." He set the empty cup down, seeming to search for words. "Tommy's been asking if he could stay after school sometimes. Says you offered to teach him extra writing." "He shows real promise. I'd be happy to work with him." "I'd pay for the extra time, of course." "That's not necessary." "It is to me." His gray eyes met hers steadily. "Fair work deserves fair pay. That's how things should be." They stood there, the afternoon sun slanting through the windows, neither seeming to know what to say next. "Finally." Colt cleared his throat. "I should let you get on with your day." He moved toward the door, then turned back. "Same time next week to bring Tommy's payment for the extra lessons." Yes, that would be fine." And so it began. Every Friday afternoon, as regular as clockwork, Colt Ramsey would appear at the schoolhouse. Sometimes he brought corn, or late-season tomatoes, or a jar of honey from the ranch's hives. Always something small, practical, never anything that could be construed as courting gifts. They would talk about Tommy's progress, about the ranch, about books she was teaching, about the weather. Never about themselves, never about the past that had brought them both west. The visits never lasted more than 15 minutes. He never sat down, never presumed familiarity. But Hazel found herself looking forward to Fridays with an anticipation that worried her. She would catch herself checking the clock as the afternoon wore on, listening for the sound of hoofbeats. On the 4th Friday, he brought a broken bridle. "Thought maybe you could use the leather for something," he said, almost apologetically. "Seems a waste to throw it out." She examined the bridle, running her fingers over the well-oiled leather. "I could cut strips for the children to practice their letters on. Leather holds chalk well." "That's what I figured." He watched her hands as she worked with the leather, and she became self-conscious of their movements. "You have gentle hands," he said suddenly, then seemed surprised he'd spoken. "For a spinster, you mean—" The words came out more bitter than she intended. "No," his voice was firm. "For anyone." She looked up at him then. Really looked. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. His nose had been broken at least once, and sun damage had weathered his skin beyond his years. But there was something solid about him, something true. "Why do you come here?" she asked softly. "Really?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Because you're the only person in this town who doesn't look down when you look at me." "Why would I look down?" "Most folks do. The unmarried women see a potential husband and get all fluttery. The married ones see a man who chose different and judge him for it. The men see competition or oddity." He met her eyes. "You just see me." "And what do you see when you look at me?" "Someone who knows what it's like to choose their own path, even when everyone says it's the wrong one." The air between them crackled with something Hazel didn't want to name. She stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself. "I should finish preparing Monday's lessons." He nodded, understanding the dismissal. But at the door, he paused. "There's a harvest dance next Saturday. The whole town turns out." "I'm aware." "You planning to go?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Can you imagine the spinster schoolmarm at a dance? I'd spend the whole night fending off married men who think an unmarried woman my age must be desperate." "You could dance with me." The words hung in the air between them. Hazel's heart hammered against her ribs. Mr. Ramsey. Not courting, he said quickly. Just neighbors, friends, maybe someone to keep the wolves at bay. People would talk. People already talk. Might as well give them something true to say. After he left, Hazel sat at her desk, staring at the bridle leather. Friends, neighbors, someone to keep the wolves at bay. Such simple words for something that felt anything but simple. That evening, Sally Morrison knocked on her door. The girl had been coming twice a week for writing lessons, and her progress was remarkable. Miss Bennett, can I ask you something personal? You may ask, I may not answer. Sally smiled at that. Fair enough. Do you ever regret it not marrying? Hazel considered the question. I regret that society makes it seem like a failure, but marrying just to be married, no. I don't regret avoiding that. Mr. Ramsey's sweet on you. Sally. Everyone can see it. The way he looks at you at church. Those Friday visits. Mrs. Clearwater says he's never shown interest in any woman before. Mr. Ramsey and I are simply... I know. Neighbors. Sally's grin was mischievous. But maybe think about the dance. It would be nice to see you dancing instead of standing with the other wallflowers. After Sally left, Hazel stood at her window, watching the stars appear over the prairie. Somewhere out there. Was Colt perhaps looking at the same stars? Was he regretting his impulsive invitation? She thought about his words. Because you're the only person in this town who doesn't look down when you look at me. Such a simple thing, to see someone clearly. But perhaps that was the rarest gift of all, to be seen. Truly seen. Without judgment or expectation. The next Friday, he brought a small sack of winter wheat. For planting, he explained. Thought the children might like to grow something. See the whole cycle. That's thoughtful. She accepted the sack, their fingers brushing again. This time, neither pulled away quite as quickly. About the dance. You don't have to... I'll go. The words surprised them both. As neighbors, friends, but I should warn you, I'm a terrible dancer. For the first time since she'd met him, Colt Ramsey smiled. Not a big smile, just a slight upturn at the corners of his mouth, but it transformed his face entirely. That's all right. I'm not much for dancing myself, but I'm good at standing still while music plays. She found herself smiling back. Then we'll stand still together. Together, he agreed, and the word felt like a promise. He left earlier than usual that day, but the warmth of that smile lingered long after. Hazel touched the wheat seeds through the burlap, thinking about cycles, about planting and growth, about things that took time to bloom. Perhaps she hadn't come west just to escape after all. Perhaps she'd come to find someone, who could see her clearly, without the fog of society's expectations, someone who offered friendship without demanding more, who understood that sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply to be oneself. The harvest dance was 8 days away, for the first time in years. Hazel found herself thinking about which dress to wear. The harvest dance arrived with a crisp October evening that painted the sky in shades of copper and violet. Hazel stood before her small mirror, wearing her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out the green in her hazel eyes. It was modest, as all her dresses were, but well-made and flattering to her tall frame. You look lovely, Sally Morrison said from the doorway. She'd come to help with Hazel's hair, pinning it in a softer style than her usual severe bun. I look like a woman trying too hard to appear younger than her years, Hazel replied, though she didn't move to change anything. You look like a woman who deserves to enjoy herself for once. Sally adjusted a final pin. There, perfect. The dance was held in Thornton's barn, the largest space in town. By the time Hazel arrived, lanterns cast a warm glow over the gathered crowd, and fiddle music spilled out into the night air. She hesitated at the entrance. watching couples whirl across the makeshift dance floor while others clustered around tables laden with harvest foods. "Miss Bennet." Colt's voice came from beside her, and she turned to find him cleaned up and dressed in his Sunday best, though he still looked slightly uncomfortable in the formal clothes. "You came." "I said I would." "Yes, you did." He offered his arm. "Shall we brave the lions together?" She placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid strength beneath the fabric. As they entered, conversation stuttered and stopped. Eyes tracked their movement across the barn. Hazel heard whispers rise like wind through wheat. "Look at that, the spinster and the hermit. Never thought I'd see Colt Ramsey at a dance. She must be more desperate than we thought." Colt guided her to a quiet corner where they could observe without being in the center of attention. "Would you like some cider?" "Please." He left to fetch drinks, and immediately Mrs. Hutchins materialized at Hazel's side, accompanied by 2 other town matrons. "Miss Bennet, how surprising to see you here, and with Colt Ramsey, no less." "Mr. Ramsey was kind enough to escort me," Hazel replied evenly. "Oh, is that what they're calling it now?" Mrs. Thornton, the mercantile owner's wife, tittered. "You must be careful, dear. A woman of your situation? People might get the wrong idea." "And what situation would that be?" "Well, unmarried at your age, and now throwing yourself at the first man who shows interest." "I believe the lady's drink is getting warm." Colt had returned, his presence immediately changing the dynamic. He handed Hazel her cider with careful courtesy, then turned to the women. "Ladies, fine evening for a dance." The matrons retreated, but their whispers followed like smoke. Hazel sipped her cider, trying to ignore the stares and pointing fingers. "I warned you people would talk," she murmured. "Let them. They've been talking about me for years. I'm still standing." A waltz began, and couples moved onto the floor. Hazel watched them, remembering dances in Philadelphia where she'd stood against similar walls, deemed too tall, too serious, too everything but right for the young men seeking wives. "Would you like to dance?" Colt asked quietly. "I thought we agreed to stand still while music played." "We could stand still together out there, if you'd prefer." She looked up at him, saw something in his eyes that made her chest tight. "All right." He led her onto the floor with the same quiet confidence he did everything. His hand settled at her waist, proper and respectful, while hers rested on his shoulder. They began to move, and Hazel discovered that Colt had lied. He could dance quite well, with the same economical grace he brought to everything. "You're not terrible at this," he said after a moment. "Neither are you, for someone who claimed he couldn't dance." "I said I wasn't much for dancing. Different thing entirely." They moved together in comfortable silence, and Hazel gradually became aware of how well they fit. She was tall for a woman, but he was taller still, making her feel delicate for perhaps the first time in her life. His hand at her waist was steady, guiding without controlling. "Can I tell you something?" he asked as the music swirled around them. "Of course. I haven't danced since my sister's wedding, 10 years ago." He paused. "Never wanted to, until now." The words sent warmth spreading through her chest. "Why now?" "Because you're here." Such simple words, but they hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled slightly, and his hand tightened at her waist, steadying her. "Careful," he murmured. "I'm all right." But she wasn't. Something was crumbling inside her. Some carefully constructed wall she'd built over years of disappointment and rejection. The dance ended, and they returned to their corner. But now the barn felt too warm, too crowded, too full of watching eyes and wagging tongues. "Would you like some air?" Colt asked, reading her discomfort. She nodded, and he led her outside to where the cool night breeze carried the scent of harvested fields. Other couples dotted the area, but they found a quiet spot near the water trough where they could talk without being overheard. "This was a mistake," Hazel said suddenly. "Coming here, dancing with you. Tomorrow the whole town will be saying, what, that two adults danced at a public gathering? That the desperate spinster is trying to trap the bachelor rancher?" She wrapped her arms around herself. "You don't understand what it's like, being a woman my age without ever—" She trailed off, embarrassed by what she'd almost admitted. But Colt stepped closer, not touching, just near enough that she could feel his warmth. "Without ever being with a man," his voice was gentle, without judgment. "Is that what you're trying to say?" Heat flooded her cheeks. "You must think I'm pathetic." "I think you're remarkable." The words were quiet, but firm. "Do you know how rare it is to hold on to yourself, your values, despite what everyone says you should do?" "It's not about values," she whispered. "It's about, no one ever wanted me enough. I was too tall, too educated, too particular. And now I'm too old, and still too what?" "Pure," the word came out bitter. "That's what they whisper. The pure spinster. Like it's something shameful. Like I'm broken somehow because I've never let a man—" "Stop." His voice was firm, but kind. "You're not broken. You're not shameful. You're a woman who knows her own worth and won't settle for less than she deserves." Tears stung her eyes. "And what if I never find what I deserve? What if I die having never been touched, never been held, never been loved?" "Hazel." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it made her look up at him. His gray eyes were intense in the moonlight. "Can I tell you something else?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "I'm 34 years old, and I've been with exactly one woman, my wife. She died 8 years ago in childbirth, along with our baby." His voice was steady, but she heard the old pain beneath. "Since then, nothing, no one. Not because I'm mourning still, but because I couldn't see the point in being with someone just to not be alone." "Colt, what I'm trying to say is, I understand waiting. I understand choosing to be alone rather than accepting less than real. And if that makes us pathetic in the eyes of others, so be it." They stood there in the moonlight. Two people who had chosen solitude over surrender, who had waited without knowing what they were waiting for. The music from the barn seemed distant now, part of another world. "I should take you back to the boarding house," Colt said finally. "Before Mrs. Clearwater sends out a search party." They walked in comfortable silence through the quiet streets. At the boarding house gate, Hazel turned to face him. "Thank you for tonight, for understanding." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair that had escaped her pins behind her ear. It was the first time he'd touched her beyond the necessities of dancing or accidental brushes of fingers. "When you're ready," he said quietly. "If you're ever ready, I'll still be here. And if I'm never ready, then I'll still be here, as your friend, your neighbor, whatever you need me to be." She caught his hand before he could lower it, holding it against her cheek for just a moment. His palm was warm, calloused, gentle. "Good night, Colt." "Good night, Hazel." She went inside, climbed to her room, and sat on her narrow bed in the darkness. Through her window, she could see him still standing by the gate, a solid shadow against the starlit sky. Finally, he turned and walked away, and she pressed her fingers to her cheek where his hand had been. For the first time in her life, Hazel Bennett understood what it meant to want someone's touch, not just anyone's, one specific person's. The realization terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Tomorrow, the town would talk. But tonight, she had danced. She had been held. She had been seen and found not wanting. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. The whispers started as a trickle Monday morning and had become a flood by Wednesday. Hazel tried to ignore them as she taught, but she could see their effect in the way some children glanced between her and Tommy Ramsey, in the nervous giggles of the older girls, in the knowing looks of the boys. It was Eugene Hartley who lit the match that would start the real fire. Thursday afternoon. She was walking from the school to the mercantile when she heard his voice carrying from inside the bank. "Mark my words. Something improper is going on. Why else would Colt Ramsey suddenly start courting at his age and her nearly 30 and never married? They're hiding something." Hazel paused, knowing she should walk on, but unable to move. "You think they've been meeting in secret?" another voice asked. She recognized it as Bill Crawford. "What else could it be? My wife saw them leave the dance together Saturday night. And those Friday visits to the school. No man visits a woman that regularly without expectations. But Ramsey's always been proper." "Oh, that's just it." Hartley's voice rose with malicious excitement. "It's always the quiet ones. And her acting so high and mighty, teaching our girls mathematics and Lord knows what else. I bet she's been teaching Ramsey a thing or two after hours." Hazel's hands shook as she gripped her basket. She forced herself to walk away. But the damage was done. By evening, the rumor had spread like wildfire. Colt Ramsey and the spinster schoolmarm were carrying on in secret. Friday morning brought disaster. Mrs. Hutchins arrived at the school with 3 other board members' wives, their faces set in lines of righteous indignation. "Miss Bennett." Mrs. Hutchins began without preamble. "We've come to discuss the moral example you're setting for our children." Hazel set down her chalk carefully. The children were at recess, but she could see them through the window, playing in the autumn sunshine. "What specifically concerns you?" "Don't play coy," Mrs. Crawford snapped. "The whole town knows about you and Colt Ramsey." "Knows what, exactly?" "That you've been meeting secretly, that you left the dance together, that he visits you here when the children are gone." Mrs. Thornton's voice dripped with false sympathy. "We understand loneliness, dear, but to compromise yourself with a man without the sanctity of marriage." "I have compromised nothing." Hazel's voice was steady despite the rage building in her chest. "Mr. Ramsey has been a perfect gentleman." "Oh, I'm sure that's what you tell yourself." Mrs. Hutchins interrupted. "But we know better. An unmarried woman your age, entertaining a man alone. There's only one reason for such behavior. He comes to pay for his nephew's extra lessons." "Is that what you're calling it?" Mrs. Crawford laughed. An ugly sound. "My husband saw Ramsey leaving town yesterday with lumber, building something at his ranch. No doubt, a little love nest for his fallen woman." The words hit Hazel like a physical blow. Fallen woman. As if she were some saloon girl instead of a teacher who had done nothing but accept kindness from a decent man. "I think you should leave," she said quietly. "Oh, we're leaving," Mrs. Hutchins said. "And we're taking this to the full board. A woman of loose morals has no business teaching innocent children. You have until Monday to resign quietly, or we'll make this very public indeed." After they left, Hazel sank into her chair, shaking. She'd done nothing wrong, nothing, but she knew how these things worked. The rumor would become truth in the telling, and truth wouldn't matter against the tide of scandal. She was still sitting there when she heard familiar footsteps on the stairs. She looked up to find Colt in the doorway, his face thunderous. "I heard," he said simply. "How?" "Hartley was spouting his poison at the bank. Made sure I was in earshot." His hands clenched into fists. "I should have known this would happen. I should have stayed away." "Don't." She stood, moving toward him. "Don't you dare blame yourself for their small minds and smaller hearts. They're saying I've ruined you." His voice was raw. "That I've compromised your virtue, taken advantage." "Stop." She reached out, placing her hand on his arm. "You've done nothing but show me respect and kindness. If that's ruin, then I'll gladly be ruined." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. "They want you to resign." "I know." "You can't. The children need you. Tommy needs you." "And what about what I need?" The words burst out before she could stop them. I need to be able to walk down the street without being called a fallen woman. I need to teach without parents pulling their children from my classroom. I need—" She broke off, tears threatening. Colt stepped closer, and suddenly his arms were around her, pulling her against his chest. It was improper, scandalous, everything they were accused of, and Hazel didn't care. She let herself be held, let herself feel the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. "I'm sorry," he murmured into her hair. "I'm so sorry. I thought I was protecting you by keeping distance between us, by being proper, but I've made everything worse." "No," she said against his shirt. "They would have found something eventually. A woman like me, a man like you. We don't fit their neat little boxes. We were always going to be targets." He pulled back enough to look at her face, his hands gentle on her arms. "What will you do?" "I don't know." She met his eyes. "I can't resign. It would be admitting guilt where there is none. But if I stay, they'll make my life miserable, and the children will suffer for it. There's another option." "What?" He took a breath, and she saw him steeling himself. "We could make it true." "What?" Not what they're saying. God, no. But we could court, properly, publicly, if I'm formally courting you, with intention to marry. It changes the story. Friday visits become proper courtship calls. Leaving the dance together becomes a chaperoned walk. Hazel's heart hammered against her ribs. "You'd do that, tie yourself to me in my scandal." "It wouldn't be a hardship." His voice was quiet but intense. "Hazel, these past months, I've come to care for you, more than care. If you'd have me, I'd court you in truth, not just for show." "Colt." She touched his face, felt the roughness of his jaw. I don't know how to be courted. I don't know how to be what men want. I don't want you to be anything but what you are." He interrupted. "A woman who teaches children to think, who sees people clearly, who stands tall even when the world tries to make her small." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "I'm not asking you to share my bed. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I'm just asking for the chance to stand beside you, publicly, proudly. And if I'm never ready for more, then we'll be the most properly courted couple in the territory. I'll wait forever if I have to. Your worth isn't measured by what you give me, Hazel. It's in who you are." Tears spilled down her cheeks. No one had ever wanted her without wanting to change her, to make her smaller, quieter, more manageable. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes. Yes, you can court me, properly, publicly, with all the ridiculous rules and rituals." She managed a watery smile. "Though I warn you, I have no idea what I'm doing." "Neither do I," he admitted. "Martha and we grew up together, just always knew we'd marry. This is new for me too." He cupped her face gently. "But I'd like to figure it out with you." A sound at the door made them spring apart. Tommy Ramsey stood there, eyes wide. "Uncle Colt, Miss Bennett. Are you sad?" Hazel wiped her cheeks quickly. "No, Tommy, just having a grown-up talk about the mean things people are saying." Colt's face darkened. "What have you heard?" "Billy Crawford said his ma says Miss Bennett is a bad woman. I told him he was a liar and gave him a bloody nose." Tommy's chin jutted defiantly. "She's not bad. She's the best teacher ever." "Oh, Tommy." Hazel knelt beside him. "You shouldn't fight." "You fight," Tommy interrupted. "With words and books and teaching. That's what you told us. That there are different kinds of fighting." He looked between them. "Are you going to keep teaching?" "Yes," Hazel said firmly, glancing up at Colt. "I'm going to keep teaching." "Good." Tommy nodded decisively. "And Uncle Colt, you should marry her. Then the mean people would have to shut up." Tommy Colt's ears reddened. "What? It's true. You like her. She likes you. And you're both alone." Seems stupid not to fix that. Out of the mouths of babes, Hazel thought, standing. Your uncle and I are going to court properly first. Tommy, that means he'll come calling on Sundays. And we'll take walks with a chaperone, and... That sounds boring, Tommy declared. But I guess if it makes the mean people leave you alone. He brightened. Can I be the chaperone sometimes? I'd be honored, Hazel said solemnly. After they left, Colt to spread the word of their courtship, Tommy to return to his lessons, Hazel stood in her empty classroom. In the space of an hour, her life had changed completely. She was being courted, properly, publicly courted by a good man who promised to wait for whatever she was ready to give. The scandal wouldn't die immediately. There would still be whispers, still be those who believed the worst. But now she had a shield, a champion, a partner. She thought about Monday, about facing the school board with Colt beside her, about teaching under the protection of his name and presence. It wasn't the independent life she'd imagined. But perhaps independence didn't mean standing alone. Perhaps it meant choosing who to stand with. Through the window, she could see Colt lifting Tommy onto his horse, preparing to ride home. He looked back at the schoolhouse, and even from a distance, she could see him smile. Hazel Bennett, confirmed spinster, was being courted. The thought terrified her. It also, she realized with surprise, made her happier than she'd been in years. The abandoned church sat at the edge of town like a forgotten promise. Its walls still stood firm, but the roof had partially collapsed during last winter's heavy snows, leaving gaps where sunlight streamed through in dusty columns. Hazel had discovered it during one of her walks, finding it strangely peaceful despite its decay. Now, 3 weeks after the scandal had forced her from the official schoolhouse, it had become her classroom. "Mind the loose board there, Samuel," she called as her students filed in for their morning lessons. The children had come, one by one, defying their parents' prohibitions. First Tommy, of course, then Sally Morrison's younger sister Jane. By the end of the first week, she had 12 students. By the end of the second, nearly 20. They brought their own slates, their own chairs pilfered from homes and barns. Someone, she suspected Colt, had patched the worst of the roof gaps with canvas. Another anonymous benefactor had provided a small stove for warmth as October turned colder. "Miss Bennett," little Emma Crawford said, tugging at her skirts. "Mama says I'm not supposed to be here. She says you're a bad influence." "And what do you think, Emma?" The 7-year-old considered this seriously. "I think Mama's wrong. You teach us to read better than anyone, and you don't yell like Mr. Pritchard used to." Hazel smiled, remembering the previous teacher who'd believed in the liberal application of the ruler for wrong answers. "Well then, perhaps you should form your own opinions based on what you observe, not what others tell you. Is that what you did when you decided to keep teaching even though they said you couldn't?" "Yes, Emma, that's exactly what I did." The morning lessons proceeded smoothly. Arithmetic for the older children, letters for the younger ones, and a geography lesson for all using a map Colt had found in his late wife's things. The children were eager, hungry for learning in a way they hadn't been in the formal schoolhouse. Perhaps it was the forbidden nature of it, or perhaps it was simply that here, in this broken church, they were all outcasts together. At noon, she dismissed them for lunch, watching as they scattered back to their homes. Some would return for the afternoon session, others wouldn't, depending on whether their parents had discovered their morning's activities. She was sweeping the floor when she heard the familiar sound of Colt's boots on the old wooden steps. He appeared in the doorway carrying lumber and tools, as had become his habit during lunch hours. "Thought I'd shore up that back wall today," he said by way of greeting. "Getting too cold for the children to sit near it." "You don't have to." "I know." He set down his supplies and looked at her. "How many today?" 19 this morning. We'll see about this afternoon." He nodded, understanding. The afternoon sessions were always smaller, after parents discovered their children's truancy and forbade them from returning. But new ones always seem to appear, drawn by curiosity or genuine desire to learn. "Heard Hutchins is calling another board meeting," he said, beginning to measure the damaged wall. "Let her." Hazel continued sweeping, perhaps more vigorously than necessary. "She can't fire me from a position I no longer hold, can't evict me from a building the town abandoned. She could have you arrested for trespassing, on whose authority the church has been empty for 3 years. No one's laid claim to it." Colt smiled slightly, spoken like a woman who's done her research. "I've had to become well-versed in property law lately." She paused in her sweeping to watch him work. These lunch-hour visits had become precious to her, not the formal Sunday afternoon courtship calls where they sat in Mrs. Clearwater's parlor under the hawk-eyed supervision of the widow, but these quiet moments of shared purpose. "I've been thinking," Colt said, not looking up from his measuring, "about the future, about making this more permanent." "Oh." "The building needs real repairs if you're going to keep teaching through winter. New roof, proper stove, maybe even glass for the windows." He straightened, meeting her eyes. "I could do it. Would take time and money, but I could do it." "Colt, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." He stepped closer. "Hazel, this town needs you teaching. More than that, these children need you. Emma Crawford came to the ranch yesterday, asking if I could teach her to read better because her mother won't let her come here anymore. That little girl was near tears because she can't attend your lessons." "You taught her." "I tried, but I'm no teacher. Just showed her what letters I could and sent her home with one of Tommy's old primers." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Point is, this matters. What you're doing here matters. And if fixing up an old church is what it takes to keep you teaching, then that's what I'll do." Hazel felt tears prick her eyes. Why do you care so much about whether I teach?" "Because it's part of who you are." His voice was quiet but intense. "Take away your teaching, and you'd wither like a plant without sun. I've watched you these past weeks, seen how you come alive when you're explaining something to the children, how your eyes light up when one of them understands a difficult concept." He reached out, tucking a stray hair behind her ear. "I won't let anyone dim that light. Not the school board, not the gossips, not anyone." She caught his hand, holding it against her cheek. "Sometimes I wonder what I did to deserve you." "You were yourself, that's all. That's everything." They stood there for a moment, hands clasped, and Hazel felt that now familiar warmth spread through her chest. 3 weeks of courtship, and she was still getting used to this, being wanted, being valued, being seen. "I should get back to work," Colt said finally, though he didn't immediately move. "And I should prepare for the afternoon lessons." But she didn't move either. "Sunday," he said. "Would you like to take a ride instead of sitting in that parlor? Tommy could come as chaperone. I could show you the ranch." "I'd like that." She squeezed his hand before letting go. "I'd like that very much." The afternoon brought 8 students, including one surprise, Sarah Hutchins, the school board president's own daughter, slipping in with her head down and her arithmetic book clutched to her chest. "Sarah," Hazel kept her voice neutral, "I'm surprised to see you. Please don't send me away." The girl burst out. "I know what Mama says about you, but I need to learn. I need to understand algebra and geometry and all the things you were teaching. I want to go to college someday, to be a teacher like you, and I can't if I don't learn properly." Hazel's heart ached for the girl. "Your mother will be furious if she finds out." "I don't care." Sarah's chin lifted defiantly. "Well, I do care, but I care more about learning. Isn't that what you taught us, to think for ourselves?" "Sit," Hazel said gently. "We're working on algebraic equations today." As she taught, she noticed Colt working steadily on the wall, the rhythm of his hammer a comforting backdrop to the lessons. Other parents might forbid their children. The town might whisper and condemn. But here in this broken church, learning continued. After the children left, Sarah lingering to copy extra problems. Hazel found Colt had repaired not just the wall, but also several loose floorboards and a broken bench. "Thank you," she said simply. "It's good work." He gathered his tools. "The building's got strong bones, just needs someone to care for it." "Like its teacher." He smiled, that rare, transformative expression. "Maybe, though I think the teacher's bones are plenty strong already." As they walked out together, Hazel looked back at the old church in the afternoon light. It didn't look abandoned anymore. It looked like possibility, like hope, like a future she was building one lesson, one student, one repaired board at a time. "Colt," she said as they reached the point where their paths diverged. I'm ready for that ride on Sunday. To see your ranch, to see the life you've built." He studied her face, understanding the weight of what she was saying. "It's not much, just a house and some barns and more land than one man can properly work." "It's yours," she said. "That makes it worth seeing." "Ours," he corrected quietly. "Someday, when you're ready. Ours." The word hung between them like a promise, like a prayer. Hazel nodded, not trusting her voice, and turned toward the boarding house. Behind her, she heard Colt's footsteps heading toward the livery stable, steady and sure as always. Sunday couldn't come soon enough. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it winds that cut through even the thickest wool coats. By November, the abandoned church where Hazel taught had become increasingly difficult to heat, despite Colt's repairs and the small stove. She watched her students shiver through lessons, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Then the fever came. It started with young Emma Crawford, who missed 3 days of lessons. Then 2 of the Morrison children fell ill. By the end of the week, half her students were absent, and those who came looked pale and tired. "It's going around the whole town," Sally Morrison told her one evening, bringing news along with her writing practice. "Dr. Whitman says it's not serious if folks rest and keep warm, but—" She trailed off, looking meaningfully at the church's patched walls. Hazel knew what she wasn't saying. Children who spent their mornings in a drafty church, then walked home through the snow, were more susceptible to illness. The weight of responsibility pressed on her chest like a physical thing. The next morning, only 5 students came. Tommy Ramsey was among them, but he was coughing, a harsh sound that made Hazel's heart clench. "Tommy, you should be home in bed," she said gently. "I'm fine, Miss Bennett," he insisted, though his face was flushed with fever. "Uncle Colt doesn't know I'm sick. I didn't want to miss the story about Odysseus." That decided her. She dismissed the children early and walked Tommy home herself, her arm around his shoulders as he stumbled through the snow. By the time they reached the Broken Arrow Ranch, the boy was barely conscious. "Colt," she called, half carrying Tommy up the porch steps. The door flew open, and Colt's face went white when he saw them. "What happened?" "Fever. He's been hiding it." Together they got Tommy inside and into bed. Hazel loosened his clothing while Colt built up the fire, both moving with practiced efficiency born of crisis. "I should get Doc Whitman," Colt said, but Hazel could hear the reluctance in his voice. Town was an hour's ride in good weather, longer in the snow. "I'll stay with him," she said. "I've nursed children through fever before. Get the doctor, but I'll do what I can until you return." He gripped her shoulders briefly. "Thank you." Then he was gone, and Hazel was alone with a sick child in a house she'd never entered before. She pushed aside any awkwardness and set to work, finding clean cloths and cool water, mixing honey and herbs into a tea that might soothe Tommy's throat. The house itself was simple but well-kept, sturdy furniture, clean surfaces, everything practical and purposeful. But there were touches of softness too, a quilt obviously made with love draped over a chair, books lined neatly on shelves, a painting of wildflowers that must have belonged to Colt's late wife. Tommy's fever worsened as the afternoon wore on. He tossed restlessly, sometimes calling for his mother, sometimes mumbling about Greek heroes and mathematical equations. Hazel bathed his forehead with cool cloths and spooned tea between his lips when he would take it. "Don't leave," he whispered during a lucid moment, his small hand gripping hers. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised. Hours passed. The winter sun began to set, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. Still no sign of Colt and the doctor. Hazel kept her vigil, singing softly when Tommy grew restless, telling him stories when he seemed able to listen. It was full dark when she heard horses outside. Colt burst through the door with the doctor, Whitman close behind, both covered in snow. "How is he?" Colt asked, not even pausing to remove his coat. "The fever hasn't broken, but it hasn't gotten worse," Hazel reported, moving aside to let the doctor examine Tommy. Dr. Whitman was thorough, checking the boy's pulse, listening to his chest, examining his throat. Finally, he straightened. "It's the same fever that's been going around. The boy's young and strong, but he needs rest, warmth, and careful nursing. No more trips to that drafty church, Miss Bennett." The criticism stung, but Hazel kept her face neutral. "Of course. In fact," the doctor continued, packing his bag, "I've had 3 other children come down with this fever, all of them your students. Perhaps it's time to reconsider these lessons of yours. Pride goeth before a fall, and your pride in defying the school board may have cost these children their health." "That's enough." Colt's voice was quiet, but dangerous. "Miss Bennett has done nothing but try to educate children whose own parents would deny them learning." "At what cost, Doctor?" Whitman snapped. "Look at your nephew, Ramsey. Look at him and tell me her teaching is worth this." Hazel felt each word like a physical blow. She looked at Tommy, so small and vulnerable in the big bed, and wondered if the doctor was right. Had her stubbornness, her refusal to give up teaching, led to this? "I should go," she said quietly. "No." Colt's hand caught her arm. "You're not going anywhere. Not in this storm, and not while Tommy needs you." "Doctor," Whitman shook his head. "Suit yourself. But mark my words, Miss Bennett, the town won't stand for children falling ill because of your pride." He left instructions for Tommy's care and departed, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Colt pulled off his snow-covered coat finally, hanging it by the fire to dry. "He's wrong," he said without looking at her. "This isn't your fault." "Isn't it?" Hazel sank into the chair beside Tommy's bed. "If I'd accepted the board's decision, if I hadn't insisted on teaching in that cold church, then 20 children would have gone without education, would have been told that small minds and petty prejudices matter more than learning." He knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Hazel, look at me!" She met his eyes reluctantly. "This fever would have come regardless. Children get sick. It's part of life out here. But what you've given them, knowledge, curiosity, the belief that they can think for themselves, that lasts forever. Tell that to their parents when—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "They'll all recover. Tommy will recover. And when he does, he'll want to know about what happened to Odysseus." His thumbs rubbed gentle circles on her hands. "Don't let Whitman or anyone else make you doubt yourself. The children need you. I need you." Tommy stirred, whimpering in his sleep. Hazel freed one hand to touch his forehead. Still hot, but perhaps not quite as burning as before. "Stay tonight," Colt said. "I've got a spare room. You can't walk back in this storm anyway. And I'd feel better knowing you're here. For Tommy." She nodded, too tired and worried to argue about propriety. What did it matter what people said anymore? They already called her fallen, already whispered their poison. At least here she could be useful. The night passed in a blur of cooling cloths and spooned broths. Colt and Hazel took turns sitting with Tommy, though neither really slept. sometime near dawn, as gray light began to filter through the windows. Tommy's fever broke. His skin cooled, his breathing eased, and he fell into a true, restful sleep. "Thank God," Colt breathed, and Hazel saw tears in his eyes. Without thinking, she moved to comfort him, and found herself in his arms. He held her tightly, his face buried in her hair, and she felt him shake with relief and exhaustion. "I couldn't lose him too," he whispered. "Not Tommy. He's all I have left of Sarah." "You won't lose him," Hazel said firmly. "He's strong and stubborn, just like his uncle." Colt pulled back enough to look at her face. "You saved him. You stayed when you could have left, nursed him through the worst of it. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me. I love that boy like he was my own student, my own family." Something shifted in Colt's expression. "Do you love him?" "Of course. How could I not? He's bright and curious and kind, and he tries so hard to be brave even when he's scared. He loves you too, talks about you constantly, says you make learning magical." Colt's hand cupped her cheek. "You've brought light back into this house, Hazel, into our lives. I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose you." "You won't," she whispered. "Storm or no storm, scandal or no scandal, I'm not going anywhere." He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. His lips brushed hers, gentle as snowfall, careful as prayer. It was her first kiss, at 28 years old, and it was perfect in its tenderness. When they parted, she saw wonder in his eyes that probably matched her own. "I love you," he said simply. "I know we're supposed to court for months, supposed to follow all the rules, but I love you. Hazel Bennett, I want to marry you. When you're ready, I want to face whatever comes together. Even if what comes is a town full of people who hate me, even if I keep teaching despite their objections. Especially then." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "Marry me, and teach from this house if you need to. We'll build a proper schoolroom in the barn. Parents who want their children educated can send them here. To hell with the school board and their narrow minds." "Colt Ramsey," she said, a smile breaking through her exhaustion. "Are you proposing to me in your kitchen at dawn while we're both covered in fever sweat and sleeplessness?" "I am," he smiled back. "Though I'll do it again properly later, with a ring and probably Tommy coaching me on the words. But I want you to know now, while it's just us and the truth between us, I love you. I'll wait as long as you need, but I love you." Hazel looked at this man, steady, kind, patient beyond measure, thought about the life he was offering, not just marriage, but partnership, the chance to keep teaching, to build something new and lasting. "Yes," she said. "Yes. Yes, I'll marry you. Not today, not next week, but soon, when I'm ready, when I'm sure I can be the wife you deserve." "You already are," he said, kissing her again. "You already are." From the bedroom came a weak but clear voice. "Does this mean Miss Bennett will be my aunt now?" They broke apart, laughing, and went to tend to Tommy together, as the morning sun broke through the storm clouds, filling the house with light. Hazel thought about new beginnings, about teaching in a warm barn instead of a cold church, about being part of a family instead of standing alone. The town would talk, the board would rage, but here, in this simple ranch house with the man she loved and the nephew who'd claimed her heart, she'd found something worth fighting for, something worth staying for. The news of Hazel and Colt's engagement spread through Dry Hollow like wildfire in August grass. By the time Hazel returned to town 2 days later, after ensuring Tommy was fully recovered, the gossips had already crafted their narrative. The spinster schoolmarm had finally trapped the bachelor rancher, probably through compromise and scandal. But something had changed in Hazel. The woman who walked into Clearwater's boarding house that morning carried herself differently. Not with defiance or shame, but with quiet certainty. "So it's true then, Mrs.?" Clearwater said. lips pursed as she served breakfast. "You spent 2 nights at the Ramsey Ranch, unchaperoned." "Nursing a sick child," Hazel replied calmly, buttering her bread. "With Dr. Whitman's full knowledge. Still, the propriety. Mrs. Clearwater." Hazel set down her knife. "I'm 28 years old. I've been called spinster, old maid, and worse. I've been accused of corrupting children with education and leading men astray simply by existing. I find I no longer care much for propriety's opinion of me." Sally Morrison, seated across the table, tried to hide her smile behind her coffee cup. That afternoon, Hazel made a decision that surprised even herself. She put on her best dress, the blue wool she'd worn to the harvest dance, and walked not to the abandoned church but to the center of town, to Thornton's Mercantile, where she knew the gossips would be gathered. The store fell silent when she entered. Mrs. Hutchins stood near the fabric counter with Mrs. Crawford and Mrs. Thornton, their faces registering shock at her appearance. "Ladies," Hazel said pleasantly. "Mr. Thornton, I need supplies for my classroom. Paper, chalk, and new primers if you have them." "Your classroom, Mrs." Hutchins found her voice. "You have no classroom. Miss Bennett, the board." "The board dismissed me from the town school," Hazel agreed. "They said nothing about my right to teach privately. Mr. Ramsey has generously offered space at the Broken Arrow Ranch for a proper schoolroom. Parents who wish their children educated may send them there." "Ramsey's ranch, Mrs." Crawford's voice rose. "You expect decent people to send their children to a fallen woman teaching in her paramour's barn?" "My fiancé's barn," Hazel corrected mildly. "And yes, I expect parents who value education over gossip will indeed send their children. As for being fallen," she looked directly at each woman. "I've fallen into love, into purpose, into a life I choose rather than one chosen for me. If that makes me fallen in your eyes, I'll wear the label proudly." "Fiancé, Mrs." Thornton sputtered. "He actually proposed yesterday morning. In fact, while I was nursing his nephew through a fever, your husband's policies helped create by forcing children to learn in an unheated building." Hazel's voice remained pleasant, but steel underlay the words. "We'll marry when I'm ready. Until then, I'll continue teaching any child whose parents have sense enough to value education over prejudice." She turned to Mr. Thornton. "The supplies." He glanced nervously at his wife, then began gathering the requested items. As he wrapped them, Hazel became aware of other presences in the store: Sally Morrison near the door, old Mrs. Abernathy by the buttons, several other townspeople who'd paused in their shopping. "My Emma wants to learn," a quiet voice said. Hazel turned to find Martha Crawford, Bill's wife, stepping away from the group of matrons. "She cries every night because she can't go to school anymore. If you're teaching at the Ramsey place—" "Martha, Mrs." Crawford gasped. "You can't be serious." "I'm tired of seeing my daughter's light dim." "Mother Crawford," Martha said firmly. "If Miss Bennett is willing to teach her, I'll send her." "And my boys," another voice added. Mrs. Peterson, the blacksmith's wife. "They've learned more in 2 months with Miss Bennett than in 2 years with Mr. Pritchard." One by one, other voices joined in. Not many, perhaps a third of those present, but enough to show that the tide might be turning. "Mrs. Hutchins' face had gone purple. "You'll regret this, all of you. When your children come home with radical ideas, when your daughters think they're equal to men, when they can read and write and think," Hazel interrupted. "Yes, what a terrible fate." She paid for her supplies and left, head high, outside. She found Colt waiting with the wagon, his presence solid and reassuring. "Heard you were causing a stir," he said, helping her up. "Thought you might need a ride." "News travels fast." "That it does." He clicked to the horses, and they started toward the ranch. "How many do you think will come?" "A dozen, maybe," Perhaps more once word spreads that I'm still teaching. She looked at him. Are you sure about this opening your home to the town's children? To all the judgment that will follow? Our home, he corrected. Or it will be. And yes, I'm sure, though. He glanced at her. I should probably ask what kind of schoolroom you're envisioning. The barn's big, but... Actually, Hazel said, surprising herself again. I was thinking about the old church. But it's cold, drafty, and in need of repair, I know, but it's also empty, abandoned, and symbolic. She turned to face him fully. What if we fixed it up properly, not just patches and temporary measures, but real repairs? Made it into a true schoolhouse, a place for any child who wants to learn, regardless of what their parents can pay or what the town board says. Colt considered this. It would take money, labor, and we'd need to find out who actually owns the building. I've already researched that. The land was deeded to the town, but the building was paid for by private donation from the Garrett family. Old Mr. Garrett died last year, and his son lives in California. I've written to ask if he'd consider selling or donating the building. You've been planning this. Since the night Tommy got sick, since I realized that makeshift measures weren't enough. She touched his hand. I have some savings. Not much, but... We have savings, he said firmly. What's mine is yours. Hazel, or will be. I'm not marrying you for your money, Colt Ramsey. I know. He lifted her hand to his lips. You're marrying me for my barn. She laughed, the sound carrying across the prairie. And your nephew? Don't forget Tommy. Never. They spent the rest of the ride planning. By the time they reached the ranch, they'd outlined a vision the church restored as a proper schoolhouse, free to any child who wanted to learn. They'd need books, supplies, furniture. They'd need to convince more parents. They'd need to weather the storm of gossip and condemnation that would surely follow. But as they pulled up to the ranch house and saw Tommy waiting on the porch, fully recovered and bouncing with excitement, Hazel knew they'd do it. Together. Miss Bennett, Tommy called. Uncle Colt says you're going to marry us. Does that mean I can call you Aunt Hazel? If you'd like, she said, climbing down from the wagon. And you'll live here and teach school here. Actually, Colt said, lifting the supplies from the wagon. We're going to fix up the old church for a schoolhouse. But yes, Hazel will live here, after we're married. Tommy's face scrunched in thought. When will that be? Hazel and Colt exchanged glances. They'd agreed to wait until she felt ready, but neither had put a timeline on it. Spring, Hazel heard herself say. When the wildflowers bloom, I've always wanted... She trailed off, embarrassed. What? Colt asked gently. I've always wanted to marry in a field of wildflowers. Silly, I know. Not silly. He set down the supplies and took her hands. Spring it is. The meadow behind the north pasture is beautiful in April. We'll marry there, with the whole prairie blooming around us. Really? Really. He squeezed her hands. Though that gives us only 5 months to fix up the church and convince the town we're not completely scandalous. 5 months to plan a wedding, too, she said, reality setting in. I don't even have a dress. Sally Morrison sews. Tommy piped up. She made Mrs. Henderson's wedding dress last year. And so it began. Plans and dreams taking shape in the afternoon sun. That evening, after dinner, Hazel sat with Tommy for his lessons while Colt worked on sketches for the church repairs. It was domestic and comfortable and everything she'd never dared hope for. Aunt Hazel, Tommy said, looking up from his slate. Are you happy? She thought about it, about the gossips in town, the challenges ahead, the uncertain future. Then she looked at this boy who'd claimed her heart, at the man across the room who'd offered her not just love but partnership. Yes? She said, surprised by the truth of it. I'm very happy. Good, Tommy said decisively. Because we're happy too. Uncle Colt smiles now. He didn't used to smile much before you came. Across the room, Colt looked up from his sketches, that rare smile warming his weathered face. Get back to your lessons. Nephew, your aunt doesn't tolerate daydreaming during arithmetic. Yes, sir, Tommy said, but he was grinning. Hazel looked around the simple room, at the boy bent over his slate, the man planning their future, the fire crackling warmly in the hearth. This was what she'd come west to find, though she hadn't known it at the time. Not just independence, but interdependence. Not just respect, but love. Tomorrow would bring challenges. The town would gossip. Parents would object. The church would need more work than they imagined. But tonight, in this warm room with these two people who'd become her family, Hazel Bennett was simply, completely, surprisingly happy. Spring couldn't come fast enough. The meadow behind the north pasture was alive with color. April had been generous with rain followed by warm sun, coaxing wildflowers from the prairie earth in waves of blue, yellow, and white. Hazel stood at the edge of the field in her mother's white dress, carefully altered by Sally Morrison and embroidered with tiny flowers at the hem and sleeves. "You look beautiful," Sally said, adjusting Hazel's veil one last time. The simple crown of wildflowers Tommy had picked that morning sat perfectly atop her carefully pinned hair. "I look like a woman about to marry," Hazel corrected, but she was smiling. Through the window of their bedroom, she could see people gathering in the meadow. Not many by town standards, but more than she dared hope. "Are you nervous?" Sally asked. "No." The answer surprised Hazel with its truth. "I've waited 28 years to find someone who sees me as I am. Now that I have, why would I be nervous?" A knock at the door interrupted them. "Aunt Hazel," Tommy's voice called. "Uncle Colt says to tell you the preacher's here. Not Reverend Davis, he refused to come, but there's a traveling minister who was passing through and he agreed to do it. Tell him I'll be right there." Sally squeezed her hands. "Ready?" "I've been ready since the day he first looked at me and simply saw me." They walked out together, Sally carrying the small bouquet of prairie roses and larkspur. The path to the meadow was short, but felt momentous. Each step carried Hazel further from the life she'd thought she'd have. Solitary, independent, defined by her work alone, and towards something richer, fuller, unexpected. The small gathering turned as she approached. She saw the Petersons, the Morrisons, Martha Crawford, who defied her mother-in-law to attend, old Mrs. Abernathy, and a dozen of her students with their families. The restored church stood in the distance, its new roof gleaming in the afternoon sun, waiting for Monday when it would officially open as the Prairie Free School. But Hazel had eyes only for Colt. He stood beneath a simple arch woven with wildflowers, wearing his best suit but looking uncomfortable in it as always. When he saw her, his face transformed with that smile she'd come to treasure, the one he saved just for her. She walked to him alone, needing no one to give her away. She was giving herself freely and gladly to this man who'd waited as patiently as she had. "You came," he said softly when she reached him. "I said I would." "Yes, you did." He took her hands, and she felt the slight tremor in his. So he was nervous, even if she wasn't. It made her love him more. The traveling minister, a young man with kind eyes, began the service. The words washed over Hazel like prairie wind, familiar yet new when applied to her. To them, love, honor, cherish, in sickness and in health, for better or worse. "Do you, Colt, take this woman?" "I do." His voice was firm, certain, his gray eyes never leaving hers. "Do you, Hazel, take this man?" "I do." The words she'd thought she'd never say, now feeling as natural as breathing. "The rings." Tommy stepped forward importantly, producing 2 simple gold bands from his pocket. Colt had made them himself, learning silversmithing just for this purpose. They weren't fancy, Weren't perfect, but they were crafted with his own hands, and that made them precious. As Colt slipped the ring onto her finger, he spoke the words he'd memorized. "With this ring, I thee wed. I promise to wait when you need time, to stand beside you when you need support, to see you always as you truly are." Hazel's eyes filled with tears. Those weren't the traditional words. He'd written them himself, for her. She took his ring, slipped it onto his weathered hand. "With this ring, I thee wed. I promise to choose you every day, to build our life together stone by stone, to love you not despite who you are, but because of it. Then, by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Colt cupped her face gently, as he had that morning in his kitchen when Tommy lay fevered and their future hung uncertain. "Hello, Mrs. Ramsey," he whispered. "Hello, Mr. Ramsey," she whispered back. The kiss was soft, reverent, a promise of patience and passion carefully balanced. Around them, their small congregation applauded, Tommy cheering the loudest. As they turned to face their guests, Hazel saw more than she'd expected. Word had spread about the wedding, about the school, about the woman who'd refused to be broken by gossip and the man who'd stood beside her. Not everyone approved. There were still plenty in town who called her scandalous, but here in this meadow, surrounded by wildflowers and witnessed by those who'd chosen courage over conformity, none of that mattered. "Ladies and gentlemen," the minister announced, "I present Mr. and Mrs. Colt Ramsey." The reception was simple, cake and lemonade served on boards stretched between sawhorses, children running through the flowers, adults talking about crops and weather and the new school. Hazel moved through it all in a daze of happiness, Colt's hand warm in hers. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the guests gradually departed. Finally, only the three of them remained, Hazel, Colt, and Tommy, standing together in the meadow. "So now you're really my aunt," Tommy said, taking Hazel's free hand. "Really and truly," she agreed. "And you'll never leave?" "Never," she promised. "This is my home now. You two are my family." They walked back to the house together, Tommy chattering about school starting Monday, about the new books that had arrived, about everything and nothing. Hazel listened with half an ear, mostly aware of Colt's presence beside her, of the ring on her finger, of the future stretching before them. At the porch, Tommy hugged them both and scampered inside, declaring he was starving despite having eaten 3 pieces of cake. Hazel and Colt lingered outside, watching the last light fade from the sky. "Any regrets?" Colt asked softly. "No," Hazel said, turning to face him. "Well, perhaps one." His brow furrowed. "What?" "I wish I hadn't waited so long to come west. Think of all the time we could have had together." He pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "We have now. We have tomorrow. We have as long as God gives us." "That's enough." "More than enough." He kissed her gently. "Come inside. Mrs. Ramsey. Tommy's probably eaten all the leftover cake by now." She laughed, letting him lead her into their home, inside. Lamplights glowed warmly. Tommy was indeed demolishing cake, and life waited to be lived. As Hazel looked around, at her husband, her nephew, her home, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, the spinster schoolmarm who'd been mocked for her choices, the woman who'd refused to settle for less than real love, real respect, real partnership. She'd waited 28 years for this moment, and now, standing in the doorway of her new life with Colt's arm around her waist and Tommy's laughter filling the air, she knew with bone-deep certainty it had been worth the wait. Every single day of it. Later that night, as stars emerged over the prairie and the house settled into quiet, Colt whispered against her hair those same words he'd spoken months ago, transformed now from promise to reality. "I'll still wait, tonight and always, You are yours before you are anyone else's, and I'm blessed that you've chosen to also be mine." And Hazel, who had once thought herself destined for solitude, discovered that sometimes the longest journeys lead to the sweetest homes. The end. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what touched your heart in this tale. If you enjoyed Hazel and Colt's journey, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850, hit that like button. And don't forget to press the hype button to help more people discover these stories of love, courage, and redemption in the American frontier. Until our next adventure in the Old West, partners,